Hello and a very warm welcome to our event on the future of supply chains, how to strengthen the weak links. My name is Guntram Wolf and I'm the director of Bruegel, and I'm really pleased to host this conversation today. And I'm particularly pleased to welcome Ebru Özdemir. Ebru Özdemir is the chairwoman of LIMAC, and of course, a very famous businesswoman from Turkey, involved in many Turkish business associations, and also, if I can say so, a champion of gender diversity in Turkey and in the world. And you were also educated in Turkey and in the United States. And we want to hear from Ebru first, because Ebru will share with us her experience and the experience of her company, which is a construction infrastructure company, during this pandemic, how it was affected by supply chain disruptions, and of course also hear your outlook on the issue. And following Ebru's presentation, we will hear from our senior fellow, André Sapir, who is a senior fellow at Bruegel and a professor of economics at the Free University of Brussels, and actually a trade specialist, and a specialist for many things, but I would say also for trade, originally for trade, who will give his perspectives on the issue. And before I give the floor to Ebru, let me just say one or two words, further words on the topic. I think the topic of the resilience of supply chains has really become extremely relevant more recently. A lot of articles have discussed the issue, and the reason for this is that there have been disruptions, and there have been slower supply than was usually the case. For example, the Kiel Trade Institute has established that, for example, container ships coming from certain parts of China, such as China's Pearl River Delta, are now faced with very substantial delays, sometimes more than just a day or two, but really weeks of delays. And so that means, of course, that there are disruptions to the container supply, and then following our very integrated supply chains, disruptions in the production process later on. So this is clearly an issue on the sort of provisioning of goods and the supply chains within companies, the production processes. And I think this is perhaps a momentous sort of the current analysis. The big question is, how will it look in half a year or in a few years down the road? Is this just a temporary thing related to the pandemic, or is there something bigger at play? Now, I think it will be really wonderful to hear first, if I can say so, Ebru, the perspective of a practitioner, but a practitioner who is sort of really directly involved in these issues, and then perhaps a more academic take. And after that, we want to discuss among ourselves, but also with you, our audience. If you want to ask some questions to our panelists, please go on Slido and type in the code supply chains, and I will be able then to read your questions on my smartphone and ask them to our panelists. Without much further ado, thank you so much, Ebru, for joining us, and we look forward to your presentation and then to the discussion. Thank you.
Dear Guntram, thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction as well. And it's very nice to speak on this webinar, and thank you very much to Bruegel and to your team for organizing this event. And we have been following the activities of Bruegel for a long time and over the years, and we have seen that it became really an excellent and the policy research center, and it also gives us a way to follow the European experience as well as the European trends. And it's very good to see Bruegel is now taking forward this important subject of the global supply chains where we live every day, all these issues. And there's no right, I mean, and everybody's talking about that. I even had a meeting about this an hour ago with a real life subcontractors. And because we all need the supply chains to function, like as the people, as the businesses. And during the pandemic, we have realized a lot of disruptions, but at the same time, we have seen that the supply chains are very resilient as well. And we see that now the sectors and countries are all reevaluating this issue and the supply chain. And for example, the European Union, for instance, and as a solution to the fragility of the supply chains, with a view to secure the supply chains to be more to the more reliable countries, we see that Turkey is becoming more and more important for EU. It's very nice to see that with its flexible production capacity, that we have a lot of flexibility in that, harmonized technical legislations, and well-developed standards of the industry, and as well as its proximity. I mean, we are very close. I'm currently in Istanbul, and I feel very close. And I feel that Turkey has become a key actor for the Europe supply chain. But the question is, what's the model of the future of the supply chains? What will be? So as you have also stated, I'm a businesswoman, so as Andre, I cannot give you maybe an academical approach, but I can give you real time what we have experienced during this time. And I can give real time, even as I said today, last year, 15 months, and so for experience. As our group, we are active in 15 different countries, mostly around Turkey, and we have more than 50,000 employees in Kuwait, in Saudi Arabia, in Eastern Turkey, in Africa, in Senegal, in Ivory Coast, in Mozambique, and in a lot of countries. And we are active in construction, infrastructure, energy, tourism, cement production, ports, and airports management. And as I seen, every sector is very much influenced in different ways. For example, we have a fruit juice concentrate company, which is very positively influenced because the demand has increased a lot worldwide. But at the same time, because of the high transportation costs, it's influenced negatively. The Limak Technology, we have a very interesting technology company. Now everybody is like after the digitalization. So now we see that there's a lot of demand on that sense towards them. How can we make all the sectors, all the businesses more digitalized? But at the same time, our hotels business, the airports business, was very much influenced negatively. We had to close down, shut down the hotels for some time. The airports were shut down. So now, we have a lot of issues in the limitations, restrictions, the travels, the aircrafts, the tests, the PCRs, vaccinations. So now the restrictions are lifted. We see this demand is again coming up, and we have seen a very high speed recovery, especially in the hotels. Now, the whole hotels in Turkey, I feel like is full now with European tourists and so forth. The port, we have large effects we have witnessed, especially the pandemic affected the globe, as you have said, Guntram, as well. The global trade flows, it's affected on an unprecedented speed and the scale. And the shipping costs have risen so much. I mean, in the past year, if you look at the World Container Index, July 1st, it's 346% higher compared to the same week last year. Even compared to last year, it's last week, 4% is higher. I mean, even weekly, we are increasing huge increases. This is a circular problem. I mean, we see imbalances in the production and demand. I don't know if it's temporary or it's going to last more. I mean, Andre, I think you would be there to answer this. I cannot predict, but I can only say what I'm living. Countries locking down sometimes, opening up the next day at different times. Shipping companies cutting the capacity on the major routes. So you want to put your container, but there's no space. And shortages of the empty containers. So the empty containers around the world is like scattered. Because of all these problems, the exporters in our port, they have to wait for a long time in order to export their goods, and they have to pay extraordinary freight costs and the charges. And on top of it, we experienced the closure of the Suez Canal and the congestion in one of the biggest ports in China. We have huge increase in supply chain disruptions. I mean, we experienced real time on the project. And last but not the least, I want to share some insights of the construction infrastructure, which is our main business. And similar to most of the other sectors, They have caused huge issues as the construction industry itself relies heavily on the global aspect of the supply chain. Like currently, the rising of the raw materials, unbelievable. I mean, compared to last year, huge demand, delivery delays, delivery delays causing lead times to increase, labor shortages in most of the countries. We cannot transport labor from one country to the other. I mean, Turkish construction sector is strong with its engineers, with its labor, with its foremen, with all the people. We are very good in delivering. So this is unfortunately disrupted. And the cost of alternatives to overcome the labor problems and the logistical problems is giving us a lot of hard time. Now, I would like to give you a short presentation on a very important project that we are building. It's, I hope you are seeing it. We are building the longest span bridge in the world with our two Korean and one Turkish partner. It's a very big project. It's a mega project, and it's a centuries-long dream because it's in the Dardanelles area where the First World War happened. And to build this in the bridge on the Dardanelles Straits, it also has some emotional aspects. And the main span is 2,023 meters. And we are also building a 88 kilometers motorway with it. We really work hard. We worked during the pandemic, sleepless nights. I'll just show you more photos from that. And for example, very critical parts of this project was produced in China by the Chinese manufacturers, like the steel cables of the bridge. As the factories and the manufacturers were closed in the beginning, we faced first great delays in the manufacturing. Once manufactured, then the logistical challenges started. Container shortage and problem in the many trading routes, delays and increased ocean freight charges. And then these are next, we thought that we have overcome these issues, labor-related challenges started. I mean, our staff, which is more than 3,000 employees, are coming from 15 different countries. Turkey, Korea, China, India, Denmark, Japan, Denmark, Spain, from all over the world. So with restrictions of the international travel, domestic travel, we experienced difficulties to bring all these staff to Turkey. Even we brought them, we had to have the PCR tests, the quarantines. I mean, we have to put them in like 15 days. We waited for the quarantine to end. If there's COVID positives, we have to take extra precautions. So, I mean, as you see, everything is like a big challenge on this project. However, we continued working. We are still on the schedule. And hopefully next year, March 2022, we will be able, 2022, we'll be able to finish it. So these are some photos. We are working 24 hours and so forth on that project. So my final remarks, I'd like to spend a few minutes on, I'll show you this last photo. What's next on the supply chains? Personally, as Limak, we take part in many Turkish and global networks, Atlantic Council, World Economic Forum, Turkish Foreign Economic Relations Board. And in the last 1.5 years, like everybody else, we participated on many virtual online events. We always talked about something. We have to build back better. I think this is a kind of motto for the post-pandemic world. So we have to be better after the pandemic. We need to build back better. Also, building back is related to our own profession. We need to build back better the financial markets. We have to be more resilient, more stable, more predictable. We need to build back better the labor market. We have to be more equal, more inclusive, also from the women's perspective. We need to build back better all the sectors. We have to be more digital, more automated, more stronger. And of course, we need to build back better the supply chains. They need to be more resilient, and we need to be able to deliver the products no matter what happens on time and on the highest quality. And from my perspective, global supply chains powers the world. We need to really start thinking about doing things a little bit differently, which also includes a transition to sustainable global supply chains. When I say the sustainable global chains, it's the idea of the industry, the business, the human, and the technological systems in concert to create a better world, and a world where we share a deep respect for the environment and the social needs that we have to be met. Therefore, sustainable supply chains will be more and more important. We are giving a lot of thought there as well. And as a final word, from the perspective of the EU and Turkey cooperation, I think we are coming to a very critical junction from the sustainability point. And I believe that the participation in the global supply chains will create a win-win situation for the EU and Turkey, as well as the other economies in the region. And thanks to the customs union between Turkey and the EU, we have well integrated our economies, as I've said in the beginning, in terms of the trade rules and technical standards of the trade and production. Therefore, currently we are working on the updating of the Turkish customs and EU customs union so that we hope that we will be able to have a more closer cooperation for reshaping the production and trade standards towards a carbon neutral economy, which is very important for the future of the world. And these are the key factors, I think, for strengthening both sides' participation in the global supply chains. We definitely need each other. And at this point, I would like to leave the virtual floor to Guntram and Andre, and looking forward to having a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ebru. This was wonderful, and I have to say the pictures are really beautiful place.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Perhaps
I
you
will try
can
to do that.
stop sharing. Exactly, then we can see Andre. And I think you already put the finger on I think all the big, really relevant issues that we have to worry about in the future. Here we are. I think you already put the finger on all the big issues which we have to worry about, and so I really look forward, Andre, to hear your perspective on the issue of supply chains. I mean, we had the very clear example of the bridge, right, where there's a sort of there's people, there's material, but there's also all kinds of other issues that come into play to build a bridge, right? And so now this is disrupted, but is this just a temporary COVID thing, or what is it? And how worried should we be about the resilience and the sustainability of supply chains in the future? Andre, please.
Thank you very much, Guntram. Thank you very much, Ebru, for a very fascinating presentation. Not only beautiful pictures, but full of content. Now the question indeed is this temporary? Is this a temporary disruption? And we heard indeed through the example of the bridge, the disruption in the supply of the steel cables coming from China, then the logistical problems indeed, and then the labor disruption as well. So is this a temporary disruption that we know hopefully the COVID pandemic will be over in, let's say, the coming months or maybe year, but then we will close the parenthesis? Or is there really something more lasting? Is there a regime change in a sense that was ignited by the COVID crisis? Now, what I want to argue, and that's my feeling, is that it's both. It's not one or the other. There are elements of both. No doubt, some of the issues of a temporary nature. To take one example, I think the shipping issue that has been much discussed, not only in this presentation, but on the news also, partly when there was the problem in the Suez Canal. And yes, we know that the prices from East Asia to Europe or to the West Coast in the United States, the shipping costs have, as Ebru said, tripled. I think those are temporary. This is a temporary phenomenon, and there are all kinds of discussion as to why is the case, and But I think this is temporary. No, I don't think that everything is temporary. I think that there are indeed some lasting issues, and I think to see that we have to get back to the situation prior to the pandemic. There were already shifts taking place in the roughly the decade before the pandemic. I mean, if we look, over the last 30, 40 years, let's say we have 2 or 3 periods from the mid 80s up to the financial crisis 2008. We have the period that many have referred to as the period of hyper globalization, right? And this period of hyper globalization is really akin to the period of global supply chains. This is what has driven the hyper globalization. And what did drive the global supply chain explosion, in a sense? It's partly liberalization, so it's political decisions on the part of countries, including obviously China and in the Western countries. So it's policy induced, but it's also very much induced by technology. So I think there was a first wave of the digital revolution that helped firms to organize themselves on a global scale and to have just-in-time production on the global scale, not just-in-time locally, but just-in-time at the global level. And I think this was really the phenomenon of the global supply chains, in which China and the membership of the WTO by China played a huge role. So that's policy induced, but together with the technology induced, the first phase, in the sense of the digital revolution. And then when we look at the usual indicator that people use to measure globalization, which is global trade, and usually people focus on trade in goods. So global trade in goods divided by global GDP, we see that there was this very fast rise from the mid-80s to the financial crisis, and then, if not a reversal, at least there is a plateau. Okay, so there is a break. People started to discuss: is there a globalization? Have we reached peak globalization? I mean, all of those kind of discussion. And I think it's true that then, if you look at the period after the financial crisis, see, financial crisis was disruption, if only by the fact that there was a global recession. But if you look at the period after the financial crisis and before COVID, we see that we do not get back to the trend we were on before. No, maybe the trend, you cannot break the ceiling, right? Maybe that trend was not, it had reached, in a sense, already what you could have imagined was the maximum, and maybe it could not have continued. But I think there were probably also some structural factors, and I think that then the COVID crisis has accelerated. One is certainly trade policy. I think there is no doubt, including protectionism. So here we, and some backlash with China, of which certainly the presidency of Donald Trump was the major impact. And we saw already that the year, for instance, before the pandemic, the year 2019 was not very good for global trade and for supply chains, right? Everybody was sort of trying to find solutions around some of the trade measures, the very strict trade measures that were put in place, and there was obviously a lot of worry about what would happen, and in particular, the trade war between the US and China and the repercussions on the global. So there was, I think, after the financial crisis, and due to a number of phenomena, ultimately political, I think there was already a feeling that globalization had probably passed the peak. Whether, as I said, there was really deglobalization or not is something subject to discussion, but I think peak globalization. And peak globalization means also, as I said, since the hyper-globalization was really the fast increase of global supply chains, is the same thing. When we are talking peak globalization, we are talking also peak in terms of the global supply chains. So I think that those factors were there. I think also now we are entering, and when you look at firms that are positioning themselves as a result of COVID, what you, Ebru, and you also, Guntram, have discussed, the term resilience, right? Everybody and every consulting firm is selling to their clients how to become more resilient, right? Resilient is the term of the day. How should you be more resilient in your business? Okay, so every business person is trying to be more resilient, right? Now, that resilience, each firm, according to their own activity, they have to find ways to do that. Whether resilience always means to, for instance, have more local or more regional supply chains as opposed to more global supply chains is a matter of debate. There is, for instance, a very interesting work coming from the OECD saying that localized supply chains can be, in some cases, and maybe in many cases, be more vulnerable to shocks, to be less resilient than the opposite. So I think that discussion is there. So yes, there is, I think, a drive, a political drive in many countries, also because we were hit very badly, and there is the need to restart the economy and restart some sectors that were hit very badly. There is some policies, call them protectionist or whatever, that have a tendency to go towards more localized production. Subsidies, we see that a bit in Europe taking place, not from European policy, but some member states are putting in place policies. We see that in the US, and I'm sure in many other countries, the same phenomenon is taking place. Whether this will help resilience ultimately or not, I think is a matter of discussion. So if I may add 2 points, I will then finish. One point I think that has not yet been discussed, and I think that adds to the potential regime change here, is climate policy. Resilience is also resilience to climate, right? It's not just resilience to ensure that we move from just in time to just in case, sort of diversification or having closer production, but clearly countries and the European Union first and foremost probably, and it will announce more, a package of policy on the 14th of July of achieving the objective of the Green Deal. Now, I think in the climate policies, what we will see, not just in Europe, but I think globally, is definitely an increase in carbon prices. And that, I think, in and of itself, even if the intention is not at all protectionist, there may be also some protectionist element, but even leaving aside the protectionist discussion, I think the higher carbon prices will have impact on global supply chains, will have an impact on transportation. Fuel costs for shipping companies that may be affected, and I think the package of policies that the Commission is putting forward on the 14th of July will also touch on fuel for shipping. So those elements are there, and I think inevitably, as we are implementing more and more policies to limit carbon emissions, I think this will go, and therefore, carbon prices are increasing. I think it will have a negative, maybe a desirable in part, impact on global supply chains. So I think let me stop here. I think we can discuss also the issues of digital technologies. I mean, what's happening with artificial intelligence? That trend, you know, the digital trend is not a new trend, but it's shifting in its nature. And I think we are moving towards manufacturing, which may become also, in a sense, more localized, because part of the reason for global production was related to labor costs. If labor becomes in manufacturing, I'm not talking about services, but in manufacturing, if labor becomes a less important component of production, because of more robotics, because of more artificial intelligence, then that may also impact the localization of production. Production may be taking place closer to consumption than it is at the moment. And then Ebru is very, very right, I think. What does it mean from an EU perspective, also, not just for us in the European Union, but also for our policies towards our neighbors, including Turkey? And I think Ebru was very right, in my view, to end a presentation by making reference to the customs union and the modernization of the customs union. This is a rather vexed issue of the relationship between the EU and Turkey. I personally have been involved in this discussion for at least 30 years with EU officials and with Turkish officials. And yes, the customs union, we see now, the customs union was, I think, the right response 20 years ago, but it's not anymore the right response for the world we are in. So the modernization of that relationship, I think, is needed from an economic perspective, but then there is obviously the political environment that is obviously beyond my pay grades. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, André. And there was really a lot of material in your short presentation. And I mean, I think to perhaps summarize it a little bit brutally, I think you were saying really on the more pandemic related disruptions, this is going to be dependent on the pandemic. And as we exit the pandemic, those disruptions in the supply chains are likely to go away. However, there are very important long-term trends that may mean that actually supply chains will change, perhaps get shorter, perhaps get more regional. And I think among those big trends, you mentioned the sort of more geopolitical trade policies, and then the environment and climate policies, and perhaps last but not least, the more direct trade policies, and of course the relations or customs unions and all of those things. So really quite important, and technologies. You also mentioned technologies, of course. So quite important long-term trends that I think are influencing the shape of supply chains. I mean, if I can perhaps just throw sort of one question at you. I mean, Ebru, of course, you can react to everything what you're most interested in. But I think one perhaps aspect I thought would be something that you could perhaps can also really from your business experience give us a sense of. I mean, this discussion of regional supply chains versus global supply chains. This has been a very active discussion at the beginning of the pandemic. Many people were saying, oh, now is the time to reshore, right? We move away from China and put in the EU, a lot of people were saying, we move away from China, we put production in Central and Eastern Europe. And the paradoxical situation now is, of course, that demand from China is at an all-time high, right? I mean, so there's a huge demand for Chinese products at the moment. And so I think André's argument or André's question, you know, do you really get more resilient, more stable supply chains when you procure and get your stuff locally? locally meaning, let's say, Turkey and the neighborhood, or Europe and the neighborhood, is that really a better model and a more stable model, a more resilient model than a real global diversified model? And how would you consider this issue from a business perspective? I mean, would you like to have local suppliers, more local suppliers? Do you think that will be more stable, or how do you think about this, the resilience of your supply chain?
Uh, Thank you. I mean, this is a great question because I was actually taking notes when Andrew was speaking. I mean, when he was questioning, is more local, more resilient? So this is during the pandemic time when all the borders were closed and when the Suez Canal was closed and the factories in China were closed. Of course, I was like, well, I wish we could have produced all these cables in Turkey. And I wish we have all these operators are in Turkey. I don't need to bring them from India because, you know, India is also, Turkey closed its borders with India. So during the pandemic where everyone become very protectionist about their own country, of course, you want to be sustainable within your own country. And maybe the same is valid for Europe and Turkey. I mean, rather than bringing everything from China, Turkey could be a good source for Europe for our exports and more resilient in that sense. Yes, resilience has become very interesting word. But I think now we have lived this in the short term in the last 15 months. So now all the countries will build this, will build on it. And at the same time, thinking of also the climate perspective, climate resilience as well. So I think I will build my competence on, for example, commissioning of a dam, because we commissioned a dam, a hydropower plant in Turkey during the worst part of pandemic where all the airports were closed. And normally we would have brought all the experts to Turkey from Austria. But what we did is we had this online commissioning, but we were successful. We saw that we have this expertise and we were good at it. So basically probably we'll do in the next one, we'll do online as well. But probably for the production, we will gain these expertise in Turkey as well. This will be our aim at least. And at the same time, I think Turkey will be a good source as an alternative to China in some aspects for European Union. This is the reason I think economically, I totally agree with you. Economically, it makes sense to modernize the customs union as soon as possible.
Yes, and we are starting to also get the first questions. And let me remind our audience, if you would like to ask a question, go on Slido and type in the word supply chains and ask your question. I can see it here on my smartphone. And one question here is on the carbon border adjustment mechanism and to what extent it affects global supply chains. And I really think I want to have both of you. I mean, André, perhaps more specifically on the carbon border adjustment, but Ebru, you perhaps more generally on the environmental question, because you also mentioned that topic quite prominently. I mean, do you think environmental considerations mean that supply chains have to become quite different, perhaps shorter, or is the opposite the case? I mean, what is your view on this? But André, perhaps we take you first on the more specific carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is now very much discussed, and the European Commission will come up with its proposal, which is quite a narrow carbon border adjustment mechanism, which only covers a few sectors and has long introduction time. Will this affect supply chains, or on the contrary, will it actually help avoid disruptions of supply chains?
So you're right, Guntram, that the Commission, as I indicated before, on the 14th of July, will announce a package of measures, carbon-related measures, including one of those measures will be the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment measure. There's been a preliminary text that was leaked, and whether the final text will be exactly the same or not, we shall see. And there's been already a lot of discussion. I think what we know is that some major sectors like steel to take an example, since everyone was talking about or the bridge that her company is involved with. And Turkey is also an important supplier of steel products to the EU. So yes, we can be sure that steel will be covered by the measures, and therefore we can imagine that there will be an impact for suppliers, including for Turkey. Now, what exactly the impact will be, however, I think we will have to not only wait for the 14th of July, but probably we will have to wait for the implementing legislation. I think what we are going to get on the 14th of July is a framework, more than a philosophy, but still a framework. And as usual in those issues, the real meat as far as trade impact is concerned is when the details will come. And so I think that is a bit too early at the moment. But I think in general the CBAM has potential to have important effect. I mean, after all, I think, and this is what I personally will be looking at, number of countries, including the EU's, do have a carbon pricing mechanism, right? We have the ETS in the European Union. In other parts of the world, there are other mechanisms. So, there's carbon pricing in number of jurisdictions. No country, no jurisdiction so far has extended its domestic carbon pricing to foreign producers, to foreign produced goods, right? It only affects production within the jurisdiction. So this is going to be a first. And I think this is for people like me, who are looking at the trading system. This is why we want to watch this, how it will be implemented. I think that in principle, the CBAM can be a positive element, can be positive certainly for climate, and if implemented well, need not be disruptive to the global trading system and to global trade. But this is if. And that's why the details will be very, very important. So potentially this can do good, but potentially it can do harm as well. And harm means it can get into trade wars and trade fight, and not only with Turkey, but obviously the EU with the US, with China, and with all of our partners. And I think this is what we need to look at. But I'm not someone who is against the CBAM on principle.
Exactly.
I do recognize its potential contribution for the carbon issue, for the climate issue. So I'm one who is more pragmatic and will be looking at the details to see whether indeed it is implemented in a manner that meets the objective that we want, the climate objective, and does not affect trade, or at least to a minimum extent.
Yeah, thank you, Andre. And I mean, on this issue, I mean, we could have and we had already full seminars, and we could have another full seminar. But I just to underline this point, I mean, if the CBAM is well designed, it in principle removes a distortion that the domestic carbon tax would impose on the domestic producers relative to the foreign producers. So if well designed, it has, I think, a completely legitimate place and would not disrupt supply chains. On the contrary, it would make sure that there's a level playing field between the foreign and the domestic producers, which the domestic tax on its own would actually undermine. But of course, implementation and the specifics matter here. And we haven't yet studied the final draft legislation, but I understand also, Andre, you will be coming out, and to our audience also, we will have a piece by Andre, I think in the week after the 14th of July, which will discuss exactly this issue and what the legislation says in detail. So watch that space. Ebru, on the environmental issues more broadly, I mean, how do you see them affecting supply chains?
First of all, we always follow all the EBRD guidelines, IFC guidelines, and whatever projects we build. You know, the photos you've seen, Çanakkale Bridge is compliance with all the regulations. And since the announcement in 2019, as Turkey and the Turkish private sector, the Turkish Foreign Economic Council, we have been closely following the initiatives that has been taken by the EU under the Green Deal. But we have also stressing sometimes the issues, if all these precautions are taken, or if this road is taken, this should not end in a protectionist or maybe discriminatory measures. I mean, we are in every platform, I think the Turkish government as well, and also the private sector, we are stressing that as well. So we think that this is the initiatives we give a lot of utmost importance as the private sector too. But when we are applying, I think you have been doing a lot of, as you said, seminars on this. We should not go to a direction that will harm the modernized customs deal or customs union agreement. Probably, I mean, we will see some issues over there. But we will keep on doing our homework and giving you updates on that as well.
Wonderful. We have a few more questions, so let me perhaps read 3 or 4 questions now in one row, and then you know, both of you can react to some of them, the ones that you have that you feel you want to answer. So one question, and they overlap with some of the issues we have really already discussed, but I think it's good to go in some more detail. So one question here is about the appearance of mini supply chains in a context of globalization. Are we going to see this, and how will it look like? And on the technology side, there was a question on the future of blockchain tech in supply chain industry, whether blockchain technology will affect the supply chain industry. And perhaps the last 2 are on the role of governments in strengthening supply chain resilience, and what is the role of government, and what is the role of the private sector really? I mean, how do we organize that? And lastly, which supply chains will not change despite being negatively affected by the pandemic? So these are, I think, 4 questions that are all related to the issues we discussed. So just to recap, globalization is one, blockchain is the second, the third is the role of the government versus the private sector, and lastly, which supply chains, despite being negatively affected by the pandemic, will not change at all. So those are the 4 questions that our audience wants to raise, and we close the question now and go back to both of you so that you have your final answers or remarks on that you want to give on these questions, but also more broadly. Perhaps, Ebru, you want
Andre,
to start?
maybe, no, I was going to say that maybe Andre can start the discussion because they're about the future. Okay, I'm very curious as well.
Andre, please. You are muted, Andre. Yeah.
Excuse me. So globalization, okay, that's the term that is often used these days to refer to the fact that we have probably passed the peak of globalization, and although we do not have deglobalization, globalization is increasing at a slower rate, if at all, than it was before the financial crisis. I think I mean, we don't have the time to make a whole discussion, but I think it would be right, and that's all I will say on this. It will be right, it seems to me, to make a distinction between goods, that is, let's say, manufacturing trade, and services. Too often, obviously, when we discuss globalization, and I'm as guilty as anyone else, we tend to think of globalization only in terms of trade in goods. But there is also services. And Ebru, you did refer, right, to the consulting engineers and all of those things that is taking place now. And I mean, that's what we have seen also through the pandemic and through what we are doing right now through Zoom. We see that we can do a lot of activity, even more than we thought we could before the crisis. We can do a lot of activity online. And Richard Baldwin, who is at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, who has written a lot about this, also talks about telemigration. For high-skilled labor, there's probably no need for high-skilled labor to move across border physically. Much of this can be done online, and I think you, Ebo, is already involved with your company in some of that. So when we talk about
so are we, Andre, as a company. Of course, we
exactly
do telemigration here with our events and our people working from different parts of the world.
Absolutely. So I would say the term globalization, I think, applies well, seems to me, for trade in goods. But I think as far as trade in services is concerned, we may be seeing a period of hyper-globalization coming, not through movement of people physically crossing border, but people crossing digital borders. I have nothing to say about the blockchain technology, or what kind of effect it may have on the role of governments in strengthening resilience. I think Ebru would be much better placed than I am. But yes, I do think that governments have obviously a role to play. The first role, obviously, is for the private sector. It's for private sectors to know what kind of decisions they need to take to improve their resilience. But not all companies are large companies. And probably for small and medium scale enterprises, their government can help firms to have better knowledge of the kind of situations they are facing that they may not be aware. So I think it's more awareness, education, things of that nature. And which supply chains will not change at all? I mean, my sense is that many will not change. So yes, there is this discussion. The global supply chains, they were driven by issues of competitiveness and the reasons that I gave before, policy changes and technological changes. Those are the real drivers. And I think those are fundamental drivers. I think that indeed today, in today's world, firms need to add a dimension, which is the resilience, right? Sort of the risk that are there. And I think, as I try to argue, whether the risk is greater when you do reshoring or when you keep the global production, I think that will depend upon the sectors. It seems to me that global supply chains are here to stay in general. But in some specific areas, semiconductors, where there are also issues of geopolitics, some pharmaceutical products, some products that are really essentials, there, I think no doubt there's going to be, and there is already some reshoring. And I'm including in the reshoring also the regional dimension that may be part of it. But I don't think it applies across the border. The issues that I think to me are still a question mark is what will be the impact of climate policies. I think climate policies, as we implement them, and in a rather more aggressive manner, right? In order to try and meet the 2050 objectives, and we know that it's going to be very hard now to meet the 2050 objectives of the Paris Agreement. But if we are really increasing our policies in terms of climate, there I think it could have important impact on supply chain. Much more, it seems to me, than what the pandemic will have left as a trace.
Okay, Ebru, please.
Okay, yeah, I was just going to give the same example on the semiconductors and the dependence of Taiwan's semiconductor production, the whole world, and then the automotive sector in Germany was about to stop. So I think these, or the pharmaceuticals. So I agree with Andre that the very critical items probably, and the same is valid for the Suez Canal. We were waiting for our products on the way out of the canal, and it was not coming to Turkey, to Dardanelles, due to the closure. So we have to, probably there'll be two things. One is the countries will look for alternative sources for the very important products, like the semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, or the things that we definitely need to survive. Or the second one is we probably will have to come up with alternative methods of transportation to Suez Canal or the other. Maybe we will build some other canals and so forth. So this is the other thing. And the third thing is that's very interesting is the current energy issues in Iran or in Africa. I mean, we are active in Ivory Coast. There's not electricity in 15 days and there's electricity in 15 days. So basically the climate issues, we are taking precautions, but some parts of the world, we still have to have electricity despite everything. So I mean, yes, we have to be resilient. Yes, we have to be climate neutral, but one part of the world is still lacking. It's so much behind. So I think this has to be kept in our mind. I mean, we are Turkey, Europe, but there's a whole big continent, Africa and other countries that definitely need other sources of energy, because if there's no electricity, there's nothing. So I think this should be probably in the agenda. So regarding the roles of the governments, I think the governments should vaccinate as many people on earth as possible immediately. So basically there's vaccination surplus in some countries, there's no vaccination in other countries. If we don't have vaccinations, I don't think we'll be able to have free travel, free access. So this is, I think, number one priority. And I agree with Andre that despite everything, probably the major trade routes or the supply chains will stay as it is for some more time. If we have new technological advances or developments, then probably this will change, but for the moment, the majority will stay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ebru. And I think also you're ending on the emphasis that government really has an important role to play in vaccinating and overcoming this health crisis, and not just domestically, but really globally, I think is a very important warning, which of course goes beyond the resilience of supply chains. It's all about our health situation, our economic welfare, our daily lives. So it's a super important topic on which a lot of work has been done and will have to be done, and an important role for the government, obviously. So I'm afraid our time is coming to an end. Thank you so much, Ebru. Thank you so much, Andre, for this fascinating discussion of supply chains. Many more issues could be discussed, but we had a very productive 1 hour. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting, and nice to be with you, Andre and Guntam, and with Bruegel.
Thank you.